Amira once told me, we were talking one time about the checkpoints, which I'm going to talk about a little bit now. And she said one line. She once told me a line which has really forever stayed with me, which is, the problem with the occupation is not so much the stealing of land, because theoretically you can give back land, but it's the stealing of one's time. And it's that time that you can't give back. And so when she talks about the checkpoints and the checkpoints that are being imposed on the Palestinians, in theory, the settlements may one day go away. In theory, the wall may come down. In theory, the entire West Bank and Gaza Strip may become a Palestinian state, in theory. But one thing that we will never, ever be able to gain back is the time that we spent at those checkpoints, waiting and waiting and waiting, just to be able to do the basic things of life, like go to school, go to the hospital, meet your friends, and meet your family. And so Amira always has this great way of bringing things down to what real life is like, something that I, being one of the privileged, don't have to experience. I don't have to live behind the checkpoints. I experience them, but I don't have to go through the exact same situation. So thank you very much, Amira. So what I wanted to talk about was, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time, I'm not going to be too long, and I'm going to open it up for questions sooner rather than later, about the closure system in general. And I want to go back to the theory of Israel as a state, and what it meant to create this state, and how that theory has actually now permeated into what Palestinians live today, now in the year 2006. And so I want to begin by saying that one of the challenges that Israel has always faced is, how is it that they contain this demographic threat? The demographic threat being the Palestinians, who are not Jewish. And how is it that Israel remains a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, if that's what it means, when it's in the presence of so many Palestinians? I mean, Israel was imposed upon the Palestinians, not Palestinians imposed upon Israel. And so the challenge for Israel has always been, how is it that we maintain a Jewish majority in the land, in this state? And there were a number of means of doing this, maintaining the Jewish majority. The first, of course, was in 1948, when thousands of Palestinians were either expelled or fled their homes, and were never allowed to return back. And so the way that they maintained the Jewish majority was to actually create a majority, expel or cause people to flee, and while simultaneously allow for the immigration of Jews into, unfettered immigration of Jews into what is now Israel. And that was one means of dealing with this demographic threat. And you deal with it by creating a numbers balance, increase the number of Jews, decrease the number of Palestinians. And so that was something that was done in 1948. Now that same theory, that same tactic, is no longer something that's acceptable in the year 2006. I mean, the idea of wholesale flight of a population is something that is no longer considered acceptable in this day and age. And I don't think that it's going to happen again. But what is acceptable is the idea of containment of a demographic threat. And so how is it that you contain this demographic threat? Well, it was the means that was used from all the way from 1948 until today was to try to contain the Palestinian presence inside, whether it's Israel or now the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And so the closure that you hear about today, I'm sure that when you read the newspapers, that you see things like checkpoints, or you hear about these checkpoints. The checkpoints are not actually at all new. This is not the advent of something that happened in the year 2000 as the result of suicide bombings, not at all. This came as the result of way back from 1948, when Palestinians such as my parents, who lived inside Palestinian towns, including such as Nazareth, which is inside Israel, were subjected to a series of closures, and where they had to actually obtain Israeli permission to be able to move from one area to the next. So, for example, my father and my mother, although they are Israeli citizens who lived in Nazareth, up until 1966, they actually required Israeli permission to be able to go to the neighboring city, which is 30 minutes away. And that permission, as Amira said, is not something that's always given. It's simply the ability to apply for permits, but doesn't mean that you will always be granted a permit. And in the case of many Palestinians up until 1966 who lived inside Israel, many people were not actually granted permits. Earlier this morning I was telling you the story of my father, who after his brother passed away, after his brother was killed, he thereon after was never allowed to obtain a permit. He was now considered to be a security risk, even though he had done nothing other than lose a brother. And so that system of closure, that system of permits, ended inside Israel for Palestinians inside Israel in 1966, but then ended up being replicated in 1991 and continues to this very day. So what is the permit system? What is the closure system? What is it entirely all about? And what it is, this is the question that I'm asking. I'm going to answer it by sort of referring, do you have another? No, if you've got another one with the areas, no, that other one. Yeah, that's good. What you see on this map is you're going to see a couple of things. And the whole idea, as I said, was how do you contain the demographic threat while at the same time try to take as much Palestinian land as possible. And so it was these two fundamental tendencies that have been driving what you now see and what you now read about today. So on this map, there's a few things that I want you to pay attention to. And the first is that you see those dark, they look sort of brownish, blackish areas. Those are the black dots. I don't think you can see them very well, but those are the Israeli settlements. And I'm going to talk about those in a second. And then you've got this kind of yellowy, brownish spots. Those are where the vast majority of Palestinians live, and I'm going to describe this entire system. So what you basically see on this map was, because there was this tendency of how is it that Israel's to contain this demographic threat, there were two things that ended up being put into place. One is actual cut off the people from the land, and the second policy is to actually take the land itself. And so one of the most ironic things that happened during the so-called peace process during the period 1993 to the year 2000 was that rather than we actually moving towards a system where this was actually being eliminated, it actually led to the legalization of this entire system that you see here, which is in many respects does replicate apartheid. So what does this whole system mean? The first is that following the 1993 so-called peace agreements, where everybody was looking at handshakes and agreements and all of that sort of stuff, and all of your media coverage was dominated by this agreement here, this handshake there, these people, oh, can't they just simply get along and there's going to be peace? What was going on underneath, which very few people, apart from Amira, were actually reporting, was the subtext of it and the continuation, in fact, if not the cementing in of the policy of closure and the cementing in of the occupation. And so there were two things that ended up happening. The first was that more checkpoints ended up going up around Palestinian areas. For the first time, let me back up. For the first time, you actually saw in the West Bank that areas were suddenly divided. Rather than it simply being a question of one entire territory, you actually saw the division of territory into what were called areas A, areas B, and areas C. And don't worry about the letters, it's not a big deal. But the basic essence of it was that there were suddenly things called Palestinian areas. And there were suddenly things called non-Palestinian areas. And so how is it that you define a Palestinian area from a non-Palestinian area? Well, you have to have some sort of delineation. And the way that you delineate it is by putting up checkpoints around the Palestinian areas. And so what ended up happening as a result of Oslo was that Palestinian areas, where the vast majority of Palestinians lived, Palestinians in the West Bank are actually concentrated into large cities. It's kind of like America, concentrated into large cities. But surrounding all of those Palestinian cities were suddenly checkpoints. And so rather than being able to travel from north to south, I'm not even talking about going into Israel, I'm talking about Palestinians who want to go from the northernmost tip to the southernmost tip, or from the northern to the center, or from the center to the south, whatever it was, they suddenly now needed Israeli permission to travel within their own area, to go from one area to the next. And that permission was not always granted. And as Amira has illustrated very well with the stories of her friends, that in many cases what was the reason that they were denied the ability to travel was simply for unspecified, quote-unquote, security reasons. Now, as the years progressed, more and more and more checkpoints ended up going up around Palestinian areas, to the point where you now actually see Palestinian areas where they're completely surrounded, in the case of Nablus, or in the case of Ramallah, where you have one outlet, or in the case of Jenin, where you have one outlet, completely surrounded by Israeli checkpoints, where a Palestinian actually needs to go to an Israeli office, to go to the Israeli army, to obtain permission to be able to travel from one area to the next. Now, the absurdity of this situation, the way that it's now played out itself now, is that fewer than 30% of Palestinians are actually eligible to even apply for a permit today. So fewer than 30% are even eligible to apply, and fewer than 10% of Palestinians in the West Bank actually receive a checkpoint now, a permit to be able to travel. This is, again, not to travel into Israel. This is simply to travel within their own territory, for going from one area to the next. And so the entire idea is that what Israel can do is it can simultaneously contain the demographic threat, and at the same time there's another process that takes place, which is the taking of the land. So by containing the so-called demographic threat, it frees Israel up to be able to begin the settlement expansion. Settlement project, the settlement expansion. Now, what are the settlements? The settlements are housing that is Israeli-only housing, built on land.
Jews
that,
only.
Yeah, Jews only. Yeah, Jews only housing that on land that belongs to Palestinians. So Palestinians have no right to access this land, even though it's theirs. They have no right to visit these places, even though it's theirs. They have no right to even buy these places, even though it's their land. So even somebody whose land was taken without compensation being paid, would not even have the right to go back and purchase that house that was actually built on their land. And that's what the whole settlement project has been about. So the dual process has been try to put into place as many checkpoints as possible to confine the Palestinians into as little space as possible and take up as much Palestinian land as possible. And so during the period of 1993 to the year 2000, again, this is the period when everybody was focused on peace. There's going to be negotiations, there's going to be a future deal, and great offers, generosity, and so on and so forth. What you actually saw was the increase in the number of checkpoints by which Palestinians were forced to live in these smaller and smaller and smaller enclaves, and also a simultaneous increase in the number of settlements, to the point where the number of settlements actually, the number of settlers, doubled between the period of 1993 to the year 2000. It went from 200,000 settlers living in the West Bank to 400,000 settlers in the West Bank, and now there's roughly about 430,000 settlers living in the West Bank. Many of these settlers live there because they get economic breaks, economic incentives to live there, everything from, in some areas, a 7% reduction in your income tax, which for some people that's quite significant, to better housing prices. I once went and pretended to buy a settlement. I have to tell you the story. I once tried to buy a house in a settlement. She thought I was Jewish, and I was offered a house for a 5-bedroom home for $185,000, which is a deal. To actually to get actual incentives, education incentives, better schools, better, and as Amira has described, better roads as well. And now some of the settlements are actually touting themselves as 10 minutes from Jerusalem, 15 minutes from Tel Aviv. And the reason is because these roads are so wide, and only Israelis are allowed to drive on these roads, that it gives you this quick access into the rest of Israel, whether it's Tel Aviv or other areas. And so what you actually saw during the period of the so-called peace negotiations was an increase the formalization of the separation of Palestinians from their land and the simultaneous containment of the demographic threat. Now what ends up happening, now what the next piece to this is the wall. And can you put up the photo of the wall? A map, sorry. Here we go. Okay, and so on this map, do you see the blue triangles and the blue odd-shaped spaces? those are the settlements. Those are the settlements that are scattered throughout the West Bank. And depending on the numbers, some people say there's as many as 200 settlements. Anyway, the number is between 120 and 200 settlements. It's hard to define what a settlement is. And then the brown areas are where Palestinians actually live. Now, you can see that there's also a black line that's going along this map. And interestingly, if you look at Kalkili, which is that city to the north, the city that Amira was describing that one of her friends is from, you'll see that the process of containment and taking away the land, that's where one of the best areas where you can actually see it. And the interesting thing is you can see that the black line is not at all following the 1967 boundary, which is that yellow dotted line. Not at all. It's following it to some parts, but then it kind of veers around these blue things. Do you see how it veers around the blue dots, the blue dots being settlements? And what it becomes most stark is in that area of Kalkilia and further on, further afield, is that you actually see that it kind of goes around, it literally bypasses the settlements in an attempt to kind of confine the Palestinians, but at the same time leaving as much space, as much growth as possible for the blue settlements to actually expand. And one of the areas that you can see it the best is in this Jerusalem area here. I'm just going to stand up and I'll come back to the mic in a sec. Right here, you see where that black line is there, and you can see that what's happening is that the Palestinians who live here are being separated and confined, so they can't actually get to Ramallah. You actually need a permit to enter Israel to get to Ramallah. And in its place, enough land is being left behind so that the settlement expansion can continue. So the entire theory of containment of the demographic threat, again, I said in 1948, how do you contain it? You increase the number of Jews, you decrease the number of Palestinians. Now that's no longer acceptable. The way that you put into place is by putting into place closures and simultaneously taking more and more and more land so as to confine the Palestinians into even further and further and further space. But that's not the only process that's been going on. And as you can see, that's why the wall is so controversial, is that it's not being built on the 1967 border. In many cases, it veers very far away from the 1967 border, as you can see in some of these areas, particularly around Jerusalem, several kilometers into the West Bank. But also in this area here, this light beige area called the Jordan Valley. You know, when I show this map to some people, they say, "Well, it doesn't look so bad." Okay, so they're taking some land on the western side, but you know, there's still a large chunk of land. But unfortunately, that's not the case. The closure policy is also in place on this. On this place here, where you see those little triangles all going throughout where it says Jericho. That's an area that is now considered a no-go area for Palestinians. Again, you need a special permit to be able to go in those areas. Not all Palestinians can get them. In fact, very, very few Palestinians can get there. And the only reason that you'll be able to travel in those areas is if you can actually prove that this is a place that you actually live. So again, the entire idea is how is it that they separate the Palestinians from each other and separate the Palestinians from their land. Now, one of the last thing that I'm going to talk about before I open it up to questions is what's going on in Gaza. Because I know that Gaza concerns many of us, and I know that there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's happening in Gaza. This past summer, there was a big media display of when the settlers were being evacuated from the Gaza Strip. What was absent from the coverage was what life is like in Gaza and the actual numbers of the people who live in the Gaza Strip. And if you've got a map of Gaza, that would be great. There we go. That's perfect. Again, the blue that you see over there, those were all of the settlements. One called Netzarim in the north, Dugit up there in the north as well, and then all of the settlements there. This entire parcel of land is really tiny. It's 26 miles at its length and 12 miles at its widest point. It's really tiny. It's got 1.3 million Palestinians living on it, which makes it the most densely populated place on Earth. The most densely populated place on Earth. In the Gaza Strip, there were also roughly 7,000 Israeli settlers who were living in the Gaza Strip at the time. The 7,000 Israeli settlers had their own roads, which are those light blue roads that you see. And those light blue roads, what they were designed to do was, again, put into place the closure policy. The closure policy, the roads were designed to connect the Israeli settlements to one another and connect those settlements into Israel. None of those roads actually connected to Palestinian areas. They just simply connected to each settlement and connected those settlements into Israel. Now, on that space of land, there was, when the Israeli settlers actually on that space of land, the Israelis who were living on that land had, of course, superior rights to the Palestinians who were living on that very space of land. Checkpoints would often be closed if Israeli settlers wanted to pass. Palestinians were denied the ability to go from simply to the north to the south of their own little area because of the presence of these settlements and because of the presence of these roads. And even things down to water consumption and what was available for water consumption. As Amira mentioned, there were quotas that were put on in terms of water consumption, but there were also issues when it came to water quality. The Israelis were connected to a water system where they could drink water that was actually fit for human consumption. Many places had swimming pools. But when it came to the Palestinians were consuming and still are consuming water that is unfit to grow corn in Canada. It's so saline. And that's the water that Palestinians are supposed to drink, is water that's unfit to grow corn in Canada. But what we saw this past summer was a big media event. We saw the 7,000 settlers leave. These 7,000 settlers were actually compensated by the Israeli government for leaving. Many were provided with housing. Many were given incentives to buy houses in other areas. But yet, what we didn't see was what actually Palestinians were living under and what they continue to live under today. Many people talk about how Gaza has been, quote unquote, liberated and how life should still be so much better now that the Israelis are gone. But what I think most people have forgotten is that there were, as I said, two processes that were taking place. One was that of military control, and the second was that of colonization. The colonization, meaning the construction of the settlements, the presence of the settlers, the construction of the roads, all of that in the Gaza Strip has now come to an end. Yes, that's now over. But what continues and what nobody is focusing on is the ongoing military control over the Gaza Strip. And what I mean by that is that Israel still controls the movement of Palestinians into the West Bank. And again, Palestinians are now not given permits to go into the West Bank. This is now a blanket rule, no permits to the West Bank, unless you can prove otherwise. And so far, according to the Palestinian Authority Ministry of Civil Affairs, only 500 Palestinians have been able to prove otherwise. Israel still controls the movement into the Gaza Strip of not only people, but more importantly, goods. And I live in the Gaza Strip, and I can tell you that we're now facing mass shortages in the Gaza Strip of food, of certain types of foods, such as dairy products, flour. You can't get fresh milk in the Gaza Strip. You can't get yogurt in the Gaza Strip. It's all very bizarre. Cheese. And more importantly, medicines. It's very difficult to get medicines into the Gaza Strip. One of the the test model, as Amira mentioned, there's always a sort of test model of Gaza, and then it ends up replicating itself to the West Bank. What the test model in the Gaza Strip has been is how is it that Israel maintains maximum control with minimum responsibility. And this is the policy that's now been put into place in the Gaza Strip. Maximum control, meaning no entry in and out of Gaza by people, whether those people are Palestinians, in some cases foreigners. Foreigners can't easily get into the Gaza Strip, as I'm sure many of you know, or whether that means goods. So it's maximum control, while at the same time minimal responsibility. And so interestingly, you now hear many Israeli officials lamenting the Palestinian Authority, saying, well, why don't you just get your goods from Egypt? Why don't you just do things from there? Why don't you just, rely on the Arab world? Why don't you just do all this sort of stuff? So that, again, the idea is maintain physical control over as much land and as over the people, while at the same time absolve yourself of any responsibility towards those people. So it's not at all surprising that, that we now hear and see that the closure policy is becoming further cemented in the Gaza Strip as Israel attempts to disconnect itself from the people there, but at the same time maintaining severe control over that area and absolving itself of any responsibility whatsoever. So this is sort of the system that we're now living under. Now, before I left, about a week before I came here, I had a very interesting conversation with a person who is a strategist in the Israeli army. And I said to him, well, what does the future hold? I mean, where do you see this logically going? Where are we taking all of this? And if you can go to the previous map of the West Bank. He was very unabashed in saying to me that this is what is going to happen over the course of the next 2 years. He said, well, there's a Hamas government now. We're going to use that opportunity to put pressure diplomatically on the world not to deal with the Palestinians. We are not going to allow the frequent import of goods into the Gaza Strip. We're going to maintain this erratic system where you don't know what the rules are and where, as Amira said, you may be able to give back land, but you'll never be able to give back time. So there's going to be this erratic system of one day goods will be able to go into Gaza. The next 5 days they won't. 2 days they will. The next 20 days they won't. So maintaining that same system of uncertainty is going to remain in Gaza. In the West Bank, the settlement activity is going to continue, and the Israeli government said they're going to use these next 2 years to expand the settlements as much as possible. They believe that this next 2 years are the most crucial 2 years. In the meantime, settlements, the checkpoints, the containment process is going to be formalized. And the way that it's going to be formalized is not by more checkpoints, but by simply making sure that fewer Palestinians will be able to pass from one area to the next. Separate roads are going to be built for Palestinians only in the West Bank. And you're going to basically see the cantonization of the West Bank into 3 separate areas where Palestinians are going to be unable to move from one area to the next. The Palestinians will have absolutely no access to the border unless given permission by the Israelis. And so what you'll end up seeing is sort of 3 little islands in the West Bank and a 4th island being in the Gaza Strip. And through that, he said, both the demographic threat will be contained and the closure policy will be finally realized. So it's a very bleak picture, but that doesn't mean that all is lost. It doesn't mean that we can't still work on things and we can't still try to battle this. And I think it is very important for us to battle this, but I thought it was very important to just leave you with an image of what it is going to look like in the coming years to come. Thank you.
You've been listening to part 1 of From Occupation to Enclosure, Fragmenting the Palestinian State. Our speaker is Diana Buttu, a Palestinian-Canadian lawyer who currently lives in Gaza. In a moment, we will return to the question and answer segment of the program. Diana Buttu left North America in 2000 to assist in negotiations between the Palestinians and the government of Israel, working as a legal advisor to the Palestinian Liberation Organization. With the outbreak of the Second Palestinian Intifada, or uprising, against the continued and expanding Israeli occupation, and the subsequent breakdown in negotiations, Ms. Buttu decided to remain in Palestine. In addition to serving as spokesperson for the PLO, Ms. Buttu assisted in the litigation before the World Court in The Hague of Israel's so-called separation wall. That legal challenge resulted in a clear victory for the Palestinians, as the World Court ruled the construction of the wall illegal. In 2005, Ms. Buttu was appointed communications director for the Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. She has since left her official posts, but continues to live in Gaza, where she is writing a book on the Israeli occupation. Ms. Buttu's article, Israel's Unilateral Disengagement, Future of the Gaza Strip, posted in the fall of 2005, can be found at the MIFTA website at www.mifta.org. And now we return to the question and answer session for the program. The first questions for Diana Buttu were, what is it like to travel to and from Gaza? And In light of recent public opinion polls in Israel showing support for large-scale expulsions of Palestinians from the occupied territories, how likely is it that the Israeli government will attempt some form of population transfer similar to what was seen in 1948?
How do I get in and out of Gaza? That's a very good question, with much difficulty is I think the answer. I have to obtain a permit by the Israeli authorities to be able to enter into and live in Gaza. My permit just expired, so I don't know if I'll actually be able to get another permit. I was sort of traveling and then didn't have a chance to get another permit. But when I leave, it's very difficult. It's a very, very, very difficult process. And again, I live a privileged life. I don't have to go through the same hassles that every other Palestinian does. I can leave Gaza. Most Palestinians cannot leave Gaza. And the only reason I can leave is because I have Canadian citizenship and a Canadian passport. But leaving, on your way out, you go through this incredibly long, I think it's close to a mile-long walk. You're then trapped between two metal gates. Somebody then says to you, go, don't go, go, don't go, whatever. And then from there you're forced into a series of physical and other, not physical searches, but other searches. Like you have to go through a metal detector and then another metal detector and then a detector where you kind of put your hands up and this X-ray machine sort of whirls around you. And I mean, it's all sort of quite insane. But as I said, I am able to get in and out because I do have Canadian citizenship and because I do have a permit. So I'm one of the few who's very lucky.
Can you go through Rafah?
No, I cannot go through Rafah. That's the other thing. Rafah is the entrance point to go into Egypt. It's right over there. I'm sure you've heard a lot about Rafah. Previously, the Israelis were actually physically in Rafah and they controlled the entry in and out of any person going into Gaza and any person exiting the Gaza Strip. As of November of last year, the Israelis are no longer in the actual terminal itself, but they still monitor and have the ability to control who goes in and who goes out of Rafah. The only people who can enter in the Gaza Strip from Rafah and who can exit the Gaza Strip into Egypt are Palestinians who actually have an identity card. Now, not all Palestinians, as Amir was saying, actually have identity cards, and in the Gaza Strip alone, there are 54,000 Palestinians who don't have any identity card at all whatsoever. Many of these are actually women who married Palestinians. Many of them are foreign women who married Palestinians, who the Israeli authorities have refused to actually grant an ID card to, which means that they are trapped in the Gaza Strip. It means that they cannot leave they cannot leave the Gaza Strip via Israel because they're considered illegal, nor can they leave the Gaza Strip to go through Rafah to go to Egypt. So they're basically trapped in the Gaza Strip. And apart from, I think it's 500 of them who are foreign, there are an additional 53,500 in the Gaza Strip alone who do not have identity cards and so are therefore trapped. So I'm a person who does not have an identity card, a Palestinian identity card, because I'm not eligible to have an identity card, not for any other reason. But so I am not able to enter into the Gaza Strip via Rafah. I can only go through Israel, which means that if at any given point in time the Israeli authorities decide that I am not to be in Gaza, then I will no longer be in the Gaza Strip. About the wholesale expulsion of the Palestinians, yes, I've seen the polls, and I know exactly what the polls say, and I know that even Lieberman, one of the who obtained a significant number of votes, actually the third largest party inside Israel now, has advocated some form of transfer one way or the other. Advocating it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to happen. And the advocation of it is something that people have been advocating it for a very, very, very long time. And I think it's important to be alarmed by those figures. It is. It's very important to be alarmed by those figures because there are alarming statistics that people would talk about the wholesale expulsion of a people is quite an alarming thing. But to take it a step further and to say that it will actually happen, I think is not very likely. The reason I say that it is not very likely is because Israel is under watch by the international community. They don't do a whole lot, I admit. I'm the first person to admit that they don't do anything. But they are under the watchful guise of the international community. And what was considered acceptable in 1948, and that was considered acceptable. I mean, the whole idea of population transfer, how bizarre, was considered acceptable in 1948, is no longer considered acceptable, and so I don't actually think that it will happen. That's not to say that you shouldn't be alarmed by those statistics, you should be, but I actually think that whether it will take place won't. That doesn't mean to say, however, that something even worse isn't going to happen, which is the slow strangulation of a people, and that is something that continues to this very day. Everything from taking away the residency rights to Palestinians who are living inside Jerusalem, to things like what Amir was talking about, which is you won't being able to change the address so that you only live in Gaza, even though your spouse is not eligible to live in Gaza. In the case of Jihad, his wife she cannot live in Gaza. She's considered illegal in Gaza. To things like that, and it's that slow strangulation that I think we should be more focused on. It's the slow day-to-day measures of trying to get rid of a people or try to push them or try to contain the demographic threat that I think is much more menacing and much more evil.
The final question for Diana Buttu was, what is your opinion of the way the commercial media have reported on the Israel-Palestine conflict?
One of the things, I fault the media often for a number of things, but one of the things that I think I can't fault them on is their impressions when it comes to the Palestinians and on certain issues. The reason is we have a thing called the Palestinian Authority, and when you have you have the Israeli government and then you have a Palestinian Authority, and when you have something called a Palestinian Authority or that looks like a government, then it's very difficult for people to understand that there actually is a people that are living under military rule and that government is nothing and worth nothing and cannot do anything. But when you read the media, I mean, it's very easy. I can see why people get confused, because there's an Israeli president and there's a Palestinian president, and there's an Israeli prime minister and there's a Palestinian prime minister, and there's even Israeli minister of labor and a Palestinian minister of labor, and an Israeli minister of tourism, Palestinian minister of tourism, Israeli minister of telecommunications, Palestinian minister of telecommunications. Now, the difference is that the Palestinian minister of tourism has no control over his borders. The Palestinian minister of telecommunications, who's supposed to be dealing with your cell phone usage, has no control over the electromagnetic spectrum. The Palestinian Minister of Labor, who's supposed to be controlling labor flows and how labor is handled, has no ability to actually control how many workers there are inside Israel. These are all things, all three of those areas are areas that are determined only by the Israeli government. They are not at all in any way, shape, or form determined by the Palestinians. And so when you have the mirror equivalent of a Palestinian government alongside with an Israeli government, it makes people think that there are equals, that the Palestinians are equal to the Israelis and that they're exactly on par. But unfortunately, they're not. And that's the essence of the problem, is that there is a power dynamic, and the Israelis by far outpower the Palestinians. But when you have this impression of a Palestinian government, it actually looks as though, well, they have things that they can control all of these sorts of things, but in reality they cannot. And right now what's going on, there's been some clashes between Palestinian clashes over the course of the past 2 days, is really what I like to call two bald men fighting over a comb. It's all senseless. At the end of the day, neither one of them has any hair that they should be combing, and neither one of them has any power that they should be fighting over. So what is it that they should do instead? I think they have to recognize that they are inherently the party that is under occupation, and put into place a strategy to actually end that occupation. Well, how is it that you put into place a strategy to end the occupation? You ignore ministers of labor, ministers of tourism, minister of telecommunications, because all of that is irrelevant and they have no ability to actually control all of those things. But instead, put into place abilities to actually resist this occupation and bring it to light so that people finally understand what's going on. Things, even if you want to keep ministries, why not have a ministry of home demolitions rather than a ministry of tourism? Why not have a ministry that's in charge of land confiscation rather than a ministry in charge of youth and sport, which we do in fact have one. It's those sorts of things, the misplaced government, mismatching of government to the reality of the situation that needs to be changed. And unfortunately, I don't see it changing anytime soon, not with the Hamas government and not with the Fatah government. And it's only when they realize that they are weak and that there are people living under occupation and they need to strategize to get people to understand that they're under occupation and reach out to the world community and to the Israelis so that it becomes a costly occupation. That's the only way that I think that we'll ever end this. Thank you.
You've been listening to part one of From Occupation to Enclosure, Fragmenting the Palestinian State. Our speaker is Diana Buttu, a Palestinian-Canadian lawyer who currently lives in Gaza. Diana Buttu spoke on a panel with Israeli journalist and writer Amira Haas on April 22, 2006, at South Puget Sound Community College in Olympia, Washington. In a moment, we'll turn to a preview of part two of this panel discussion, the presentation by Amira Haas. This panel discussion featuring Diana Buttu and Amira Haas was part of the Rachel Corrie Foundation Peaceworks Conference, Cultivating a Just and Enduring Peace for the People of Palestine and Israel. In addition to Diana Buttu and Amira Haas, the conference featured Palestinian-American co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement, Huwaida Araf, senior research scholar at Harvard's Center for Middle Eastern Studies, Dr. Sarah Roy, member of the Palestinian Parliament and 2005 presidential candidate, Dr. Mustafa Barghouti, and many others. For more information about the Peaceworks Conference and about the Rachel Corrie Foundation, please visit their website at www.rachelcorriefoundation.org. And now a preview of part two of From Occupation to Enclosure, Fragmenting the Palestinian State, the presentation by Israeli journalist and author Amira Haas.
The third couple of friends that I want to talk about them is, and the last, and I'll be very brief, are Maysoon and Saleh from Nablus. Nablus is the only city that has been constantly since 2000 encircled by completely by Israeli checkpoints, so that you cannot, or Israeli barriers, so that you cannot leave without being monitored, and actually by being very often by being impeded or stopped by Israeli soldiers. While from Ramallah it is possible to find one or two routes that are not controlled by Israeli checkpoints, Nablus is also encircled by those checkpoints. Maysoon is a teacher. Her husband Saleh is an employee with the PLO office. They have 4 children. Even if I had more time in this session, I wouldn't have had time to describe what it was to live for almost 2 years constantly under Israeli tanks. Israeli tanks which practically were in the same street where they live. One of the children actually has had such traumas for so long that they even thought of sending him away to recover somewhere else. Now he grew up. Luckily, he overcame these traumas. He doesn't wake up at night wet and screaming. He's not as violent as he was 2 years ago. But a few weeks ago, when the army, as it happens all the time, entered the refugee camp of Balata, which is not far away from their place, from where they live, friends told his father that he was seen throwing stones at jeeps, military jeeps. Now the parents are very much against the sort of armed struggle which turned into futile bravado in front of cameras, of carrying guns and doing nothing, or going to explode in Israel proper. Both parents were wanted in the first Intifada. The father was in prison for a couple of years. So it's not people who were far away from Palestinian struggle. But now the father tells me, I cannot sleep at night. If 2-3 years ago he couldn't sleep at night because of his son's traumas, Now he cannot sleep at night because of his son participating in throwing stones. But he says, I cannot tell him not to throw stones. It's his classmates who are under curfew now in Balata. And this is what he sees as a civil protest against Israeli occupation. But again, he cannot sleep quietly at night. Maysoon, the teacher, whenever she wants to visit her family who live in a nearby village, has to go through a checkpoint. Now, this meant that it's about a 15 kilometers distance, something like 7-8 miles distance. For 2 years, she could not visit her family. Now she can visit, but because they removed one of these checkpoints. But then now it is a flying checkpoint, which means it's not every day. But when there is a checkpoint there, it keeps people, it's one of the most vicious checkpoints that exist. It keeps people there waiting for between 3 hours to 18 hours. And this I checked and monitored. At one point, and because it's such a narrow road that when you are stuck there and they don't let you move, you just can't move back either. So this is her village. When she goes to work, it's on the southern side of Nablus. She also has to go through a checkpoint or a barrier, which means being always late for school or getting up very early not to get late to school. And again, it's a distance of 5 kilometers. So to pass a distance of 5 kilometers, she needs at least an hour and a half. Both of them, because they are employees of the Palestinian Authority and PLO, are gone this month without any salary. It's almost, they haven't received yet, I think. So it's almost the end of the month and there is no salary. There is no salary, okay, we know Hamas. But there is at least $50 million every month that Israel owes to the Palestinians and refuses to give them. So we are not talking here about only the grab of land that we saw with the village of Khaled, that the land was taken for the fence. And I forgot, of course, to mention, but this goes without saying that, of course, some land has been taken during the years for a settlement nearby. We're not talking about the land that Maysoon's family lost not for settlements, but for all kinds of Israeli training camps in the Jordan Valley. We're also talking about actual theft of money. It's monies that Israel, because all Palestinian import goes through Israeli ports and Israeli customs, then it's Israeli bureaucracy which gets the customs, and according to the Oslo Agreement, it has to pay back the money which belongs to the Palestinian tax authorities. It refuses to do so now for the second or third month already, which means it's already $150 million, which means the salaries of so many people. These not very horrendous examples, not horrendous because we are talking about people who still can do something with their life and work hard in order to provide some future for their children and keep their sanity and keep their resilience, like most of the people. But their life, the way that they are being chained by Israeli rule, shows that occupation is not good anymore as a definition. It's not satisfactory. Occupation or military. It's much more than military occupation. We are talking here about a blend of military occupation, indeed, an envelope that allowed Israel to develop a colonialist system and an apartheid system. And I will not discuss now the issue of Israel proper, mostly because of shortage of time. But actually we are talking Palestinians in the occupied territories live under this threefold regime: military occupation, colonialist regime, and an apartheid regime. An apartheid regime that is, when I say apartheid regime, I refer to the fact that we are talking about the same chunk of territory which is ruled and whose development or undevelopment is being dictated by one government. There are two peoples, two communities which live in this same chunk of territory. And there is one government which is elected only by one community, not by the other. But this government decides about the two peoples, about the future of the two peoples, not only about the future of one people which elects it. And in this same chunk of territory, there are two sets of infrastructure. Elite infrastructure for the Jews, inferior infrastructure for Palestinians. It's true about roads, it's true about water, quota on water. There is a quota on the quantities of water for Palestinians. There are mechanisms which guarantee that Palestinians will not get the same quantities as Jews get. Okay. There is a set of two different sets of rights and privileges. We are privileged, the Jews. And a privilege is when a right is not given to everybody, this right is a mutilated right. Then it becomes a privilege. And we live with this, Jews live with these mutilated rights. We enjoy these mutilated rights.
You've been watching a preview of Part 2 of From Occupation to Enclosure, Fragmenting the Palestinian State, a presentation by Israeli journalist and author Amira Haas. This panel discussion, featuring Diana Buttu and Amira Haas, was part of the Rachel Corrie Foundation Peaceworks Conference, Cultivating a Just and Enduring Peace for the People of Palestine and Israel. For more information about the Peaceworks Conference and about the Rachel Corrie Foundation, please visit their website at www.rachelcorriefoundation.org. This program was produced by PDX Justice Media Productions. For more information about our programs and for broadcast dates and times, please visit our website at www.pdxjustice.org. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for supporting public access cable television.
Palestinians. And so that was something that was done in 1948. Now that same theory, that same tactic is no longer something that's acceptable in the year 2006. I mean, the idea of wholesale flight of a population is something that is no longer considered acceptable in this day and age. And I don't think that it's going to happen again. But what is acceptable is the idea of containment of a demographic threat. And so how is it that you contain this demographic threat? Well, it was the means that was used from all the way from 1948 until today was to try to contain the Palestinian presence inside, whether it's Israel or now the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And so the closure that you hear about today, I'm sure that when you read the newspapers, that you see things like checkpoints or you hear about these checkpoints. The checkpoints are not actually at all new. This is not the advent of something that happened in the year 2000 as the result of suicide bombings, not at all. This came as the result of way back from 1948, when Palestinians who, such as my parents, who lived inside Palestinian towns, including such as Nazareth, which is inside Israel, were subjected to a series of closures, and where they had to actually obtain Israeli permission to be able to move from one area to the next. So, for example, my father and my mother, although they are Israeli citizens who lived in Nazareth, up until 1966, they actually required Israeli permission to be able to go to the neighboring city, which is 30 minutes away. And that permission, as Amira said, is not something that's always given. Those are the Israeli settlements. And I'm going to talk about those in a second. And then you've got this kind of yellowy, brownish spots. Those are where the vast majority of Palestinians live, and I'm going to describe this entire system. So what you basically see on this map was, because there was this tendency of how is it that Israel's to contain this demographic threat, there were two things that ended up being put into place. One is actual cut off the people from the land, and the second policy is to actually take the land itself. And so one of the most ironic things that happened during the so-called peace process during the period 1993 to the year 2000 was that rather than we actually moving towards a system where this was actually being eliminated, it actually led to the legalization of this entire system that you see here, which is in many respects does replicate apartheid. So what does this whole system mean? The first is that following the 1993 so-called peace agreements, where everybody was looking at handshakes and agreements and all of that sort of stuff, and all of your media coverage was dominated by this agreement here, this handshake there, these people, oh, can't they just simply get along and there's going to be peace? What was going on underneath, which very few people, apart from Amira, were actually reporting, was the subtext of it and the continuation, in fact, if not the cementing in of the policy of closure and the cementing in of the occupation. And so there were two things that ended up happening. The first was that more checkpoints ended up going up around Palestinian areas. For the first time, let me back up. For the first time, you actually, sooner rather than later, about the closure system in general. And I want to go back to the theory of Israel as a state and what it meant to create this state, and how that theory has actually now permeated into what Palestinians live today, now in the year 2006. And so I want to begin by saying that one of the challenges that Israel has always faced is how is it that they contain this demographic threat? The demographic threat being the Palestinians who are not Jewish. And how is it that Israel remains a Jewish state with a Jewish majority, if that's what it means, when it's in the presence of so many Palestinians. I mean, Israel was imposed upon the Palestinians, not Palestinians imposed upon Israel. And so the challenge for Israel has always been, how is it that we maintain a Jewish majority in the land, in this state? And there were a number of means of doing this, maintaining the Jewish majority. The first, of course, was in 1948 when thousands of Palestinians were either expelled or fled their homes and were never allowed to return back. And so the way that they maintained the Jewish majority was to actually create a majority, expel or cause people to flee, and while simultaneously allow for the immigration of Jews into unfettered immigration of Jews into what is now Israel. And that was one means of dealing with this demographic threat. And you deal with it by creating a numbers balance, increase the number of Jews, decrease the number of Amira once told me, we were talking one time about the checkpoints, which I'm going to talk about a little bit now. And she said one line. She once told me a line which has really forever stayed with me, which is, the problem with the occupation is not so much the stealing of land, because theoretically you can give back land, but it's the stealing of one's time. And it's that time that you can't give back. And so when she talks about the checkpoints and the checkpoints that are being imposed on the Palestinians, in theory, the settlements may one day go away. In theory, the wall may come down. In theory, the entire West Bank and Gaza Strip may become a Palestinian state, in theory. But one thing that we will never, ever be able to gain back is the time that we spent at those checkpoints, waiting and waiting and waiting, just to be able to do the basic things of life, like go to school, go to the hospital, meet your friends, and meet your family. And so Amira always has this great way of bringing things down to what real life is like, something that I, being one of the privileged, don't have to experience. I don't have to live behind the checkpoints. I experience them, but I don't have to go through the exact same situation. So thank you very much, Amira. So what I wanted to talk about was, I wanted to spend just a little bit of time. I'm not going to be too long, and I'm going to open it up for questions. It's simply the ability to apply for permits, but doesn't mean that you will always be granted a permit. And in the case of many Palestinians up until 1966 who lived inside Israel, many people were not actually granted permits. Earlier this morning I was telling you the story of my father, who after his brother passed away, after his brother was killed, he thereon after was never allowed to obtain a permit. He was now considered to be a security risk, even though he had done nothing other than lose a brother. And so that system of closure, that system of permits, ended inside Israel for Palestinians inside Israel in 1966, but then ended up being replicated in 1991 and continues to this very day. So what is the permit system? What is the closure system? What is it entirely all about? And what it is, this is the question that I'm asking. I'm going to answer it by sort of referring, do you have another one? No, if you've got another one with the areas, that other one. That's good. What you see on this map is you're going to see a couple of things. And the whole idea, as I said, was how do you contain the demographic threat while at the same time try to take as much Palestinian land as possible. And so it was these two fundamental tendencies that have been driving what you now see and what you now read about today. So on this map, there's a few things that I want you to pay attention to. And the first is that you see those dark, they look sort of brownish, blackish areas. Those are the black dots. I don't think you can see them very well, but